Hey everybody, I was originally planning on not doing part 2 of my Godzilla 2014 review, largely because it's almost 3 weeks after the movie premiered. Everyone's pretty much said the same exact thing that I'm pretty much saying, and more to the point, it just didn't seem that important at the moment. But then rewatching the first part, I realized I brought up a lot of really interesting points, especially with me being the huge monster fan that I am. So I'm going to continue the review, just for the heck of it. Why not? And also because, like I said, it's like that whole explanation on how I ended up getting into the giant monster genre, or kaiju for shorthand, through Ghostbusters and the Godzilla New Year's Day Marathon really was a really interesting point to bring up, and especially compared to other people's reviews. I'll get to that in a moment, but also, as you can see, I have much better lighting, so I can't do stupid flashlight effects with this guy. And I got my computer right here so I can fact check as much stuff as possible. And I also have a drink so I can wash down my throat. And unfortunately, I have to make mention of this. You see this shirt? You see this shirt? This means absolutely nothing to me. I only bought this shirt because it was $1 at a very nice thrift store owned by some people I know and love. And it's a very comfortable shirt. Other than that, I don't play sports, and my attempts to play sports have failed miserably, even when I succeeded. That's a whole video on its own. So, where I left off was, okay, Steven Spielberg, you know, a lot of people seem these days to ape or mimic what they think the Spielberg aesthetic is, but in reality, Spielberg's done enough movies where you know he can do action sequences, where he can actually do fantastical weirdness. It's just, unfortunately, he's kind of got into a rut recently. But I think that's probably just with old age and a lack of creative energy that goes with it. But then again, there's also that infamous story about how originally he was going to make a horror movie called Night Skies, about a group of very, very malicious aliens who basically threatened a family on a small farm. And that idea eventually grew into the far more family-friendly, although in its own right kind of creepy, and wonderfully so, E.T., and recently the images of the aliens from Night Skies arose, and surprisingly they look like E.T.'s extended surly family. As opposed to the scary insectoid aliens I was led to believe from what little information was available on Night Skies creature designs at the time. And I can kind of see why... Well, no, not really. It's like, I know Rick Baker originally was supposed to do the effects on Night Skies, but then got really upset when it went to E.T., forcing them to get another effects artist, Ribaldi, I think his name was, the Italian effects artist who's done all sorts of good creature effects, along with the E.T. we eventually saw on screen. Although I think he was also responsible for that really terrible life-size King Kong robot from '76. You'll win some, you lose some. But yeah, no, Spielberg could do action sequences, and it's funny how a lot of people are defending Godzilla 2014 by comparing it to not only the original Jaws, but also the 1954 Godzilla, the original, or Gojira if you want to be anal about that. Godzilla, Gojira, tomato, tomato. Well, more so tomato than tomato, because Godzilla and Gojira both equally work. That's a video in its own right, I'll explain later, but go ahead and call him Godzilla. That's what I do. So, what happened was that a lot of reviewers, both in favor and against the movie, are comparing it to Jaws and Godzilla 1954. First, they compare it to Jaws, saying that the fact that you don't see the shark for the first hour is a brilliant move of suspense and cinematic thrills. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of people tend to forget that it's not because we don't see the shark is what makes the first hour of Jaws works, but the fact that there is still a very interesting story with very good characters and related actors in the first story. The whole thing about the politics of Amity, our main actors, the first one played by, I want to say Roy Schreider, although I might be mistaking him with the comedian. I could easily check it up, but I'm not. I'm gonna save my multitasking when I really need it. The guy from Blue Thunder. That's all you need to know. And also the culture, the clash of cultures between the residents of Amity as well as the vacationers, who are of course treated better because they bring in the money to the small coastal town, and a lot of other elements working together to create a really strong first half. And then of course the second half of Jaws is we go from horror movie with small town drama to a kind of comical but also a little bit tragic Moby Dick style monster adventure in the second half, where our three lead heroes decide to go out and kill the beasts. And that's good for various reasons too. A lot of people tend to forget Jaws is more than just the first hour waiting for the shark. It's a wonderfully layered and complex and multi-leveled story. Layered, multi-leveled, why the hell did I use both? That works on all cylinders, even when the shark does show up. And yeah, I know the anticipation and the build-up is better than actually seeing the creature, but let's admit it. It's a full-scale prop. It moves well. It may not be the most convincing shark puppet in the history of the... Well, actually, to be honest, there really are no convincing-looking sharks engineered, unless somebody wants to bring up a really good example in the comments below. I can't think of any. In fact, probably Jaws is the only good example of an animatronic shark in movies. But yeah, it's like I think a lot of people of today's generations, of Generation Y and the millennials, they have this insane idea thinking that once you see the shark, the movie Jaws is completely ruined. Like the movie just falls off, and that's why everybody seems to have huge emotional feelings for the first hour where there is no shark, as opposed to enjoying the movie as a whole or giving the second half, which is a different creature of its own right, pun not intended, its own dues. And that's why you see a lot of these people like Abrams, who probably is a nice guy, who was probably way too harsh on him in the previous video, although he does come off as sort of a flippant hipster in some extent, especially when you see those terrible Star Trek movies, the second one more so than the first. But yeah, they can't appreciate Jaws as a whole for what it is, and instead just focus their arguments on the first hour is great, second hour sucks because you see the shark. That's kind of a sad way to put it, I think. And then of course there's the comparisons to the 1954 Godzilla. People say that movie is a movie where there's barely any monster action going on, and the majority of it is again build up or a more serious, very straight-faced, even grim commentary on basically Japan's thoughts of the world and the aftermath of the atomic bomb being used on their country, for better or ill, depending on how you look at it in history. But let's face it, it's the atomic bomb. It's something to be afraid of even today. Except instead back then, when we had the Cold War, today we have terrorists, local and foreign, as well as the new Cold War. Thank you, Putin. I'm sorry, dark humor aside. But the thing is, much like Jaws, people tend to forget that the original 1954 Godzilla, tomato, works because it too is a surprisingly much more complex and multi-layered story than people like to give it credit. It wasn't it's a monster movie, but with a message, as well as being a monster movie made to entertain as a 1950s blockbuster. Because a lot of people tend to forget that a lot of the monster movies of the 1950s, and more so in Japan during the 60s, despite their B-movie status, at least compared to what's being made today, were in their own right blockbusters. True, there was a brief period in the 50s where major Hollywood studios tried to make big-budget or high-profile science fiction films with limited to little success. Fantastic Planet... no, not Fantastic Planet, wrong movie. Forbidden Planet is today considered a classic of the genre and very ahead of its time in many regards. But back then, in its first theatrical showings, it didn't really make that much money, and it was a gamble that didn't pay off. Of course, back then you could play movies in theaters over and over again thanks to the the fact that television wasn't really playing many movies, especially contemporary ones, and video was, as well as its ultimate descendant DVD, was nowhere to be seen. So basically, movie theaters were both revival houses of older films, as well as multiplexes showing new movies. God to be alive back then, but then I remember I'm Hispanic and I'd probably be kicked out half of the movie theaters. I just want to see Robbie the Robot. Get out. So, dark humor aside, so the thing was that Godzilla 1954 was born from the ashes of a Japanese-Indonesia co-production that never quite made it, largely because the government of Indonesia still had, and rightfully so, some anger left over with Japan during the World War II activities. So they needed a high-profile project, but one that could be done domestically and more or less on the quick, regardless what you think of the guy in monster suit effects. And that's where Godzilla 1954 came through, because during that time, two of the biggest blockbusters in recent memory was the re-release of the original 1933 King Kong in 1952, which arguably made way more money then than it did originally in 33. And then of course there was Beast from 25,000 Fathoms, the Ray Harryhausen movie that proved to be a surprise hit at the box office and more or less started the giant monster genre. Although there's a third culprit in that regard, the short story written by Ray Bradbury called The Foghorn, of which Beast from 25,000 Fathoms was inspired by, and is to short stories, comics, and novels of giant monsters, is to what Beast from 25,000 Fathoms and King Kong is to monster movies of the giant monster variety. So they decided to follow through and let's do the first real giant monster movie in Japan. There have been other attempts to do giant monsters and science fiction and fantasy in Japan beforehand, but this was like the first major serious production, especially when you consider that maybe it wasn't a period piece with supernatural elements, it was a full-on modern-day monster movie. Although I think one of the movies involving King Kong in the 30s, not King Kong appears in Edo, because that seems to be another period piece with a mythical beast, but another one, I don't know what the second one's called. I'm gonna try to bring up my notes here. I'm terrible at multitasking, so forgive me, everybody. That one appears to be set in modern times based on the very little evidence remaining of it, mostly a photograph of the title ape, but for the most part the two King Kong movies done by the Japanese in the 30s are for the most part lost. If we see them again, it's going to be a minor miracle. So that's pretty much, so basically the guys behind the original Godzilla, not only did they want to make a straight-on giant monster movie, but they were also contemporaries, and in some cases, like director Inoshiro Honda, friends of Akira Kurosawa, and they too had that mindset of wanting to do a movie with some real dramatic weight. So again, a giant monster movie, but with a message and some real dramatic chops. It's not just a grim drama or social satire, but it's also a grim drama and social satire, social commentary, not really satire, mixed with the giant monster genre. And if you rewatch that movie, yeah, there's a slow build-up to Godzilla, but it's a very good slow build-up. You are with some really decent actors and characters, and of course, even knowing Godzilla's not in the movie that much, and his rampage is like, I think, less than 15 minutes long, it's still one hell of a showpiece. It's like, it's not as spectacular as some of the Godzilla rampages we get later on, but it definitely makes an impact, and it's really well directed, and it's very wonderfully nightmarish in its execution and some of the imagery, like literally Tokyo on fire and Godzilla's silhouette walking in the background as people watch in the foreground. So yeah, it's a monster like Jaws. It's a slow build up, but when it finally gets to the payoff, it's worth it, and it's one hell of a showstopper, so to speak. Again, it's a blockbuster with a message, something you don't really see that often anymore. Giant monster movies on Wikipedia. Sorry about that. Again, I don't multitask, and multitasking is a myth. Okay, so just as a quick aside, the two, hopefully Wikipedia has. Okay, there were two, quick note, there were two Japanese Kong movies, unofficially, made in 1933 and 1938. The first one was Wasei Kingu Kongu, or Japanese King Kong. And then the second one was in 38, King Kong appears in Edo. Now, Japanese King Kong really does seem, from the very few photographs that remain from this project, really does seem like a Japanese riff on the modern-day King Kong at the time. Whereas King Kong appears in Edo, a 1938 movie, which has a really large, more photo-filled poster, reveals that the monster of that movie is more of a humanoid primate, like something out of the old yokai illustrations of Japanese mythology and folklore, rampaging across ancient Tokyo, called Edo back then. And there's a good chance that it's not even a giant monster movie. They just call it King Kong appears in Edo just for the hell of it. And the giant monkey primate man that appears on the poster is probably just false advertising, or if he does go giant size, he only goes giant size in one particular sequence. Again, we might be dealing with a supernatural yokai here, so the sky's the limit as far as wackiness is concerned. So those are the two King Kong movies from the 30s made in Japan that are currently and officially lost to time, as a lot of science fiction and fantasy movies from the golden days, so to speak. The old golden days. So the thing about both Godzilla 54 and Jaws was that, yeah, they both had slow build-up, but there was a lot of really good things keeping you invested in the story. And even when you got the payoff, it didn't diminish the setup. Now, Godzilla 2014 is trying to do that. And on one hand, you can kind of respect the movie for trying to do it, especially in this day and age where things like Transformers is considered the way to do things. I'm not good at comedy. Or am I? So, where was I? I lost my thought trying to do stupid facial gags. Oh, okay, so the fact that there is sort of a slow build-up when you eventually see the monster is admirable. But at the same time, it doesn't really work when the screenplay and the script is a little on the patchy side. I'm not talking about all the very fortunate coincidences that this movie has. The story coincidences, you actually see quite a bit in the giant monster genre. It's like, if you think Godzilla 2014 is bad with its convenient coincidences, watch Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. That movie should just be called Coincidence the Movie. I'll explain that in a separate review. But, no, unfortunately, and I have nothing against Aaron Taylor Johnson. Again, he's serviceable, and I've seen the kid act, not just in Kick-Ass, but other earlier movies he's done. It's just, unfortunately, it's another case of Hollywood giving us an incredibly bland 20-something young, leading, white, boring guy as our lead character. And you see it in a lot of Hollywood movies, to such an extent that they're afraid that if you make a female the lead character, or even somebody of any sort of color or racial difference from the bland white guy, they're going to scare away the majority of moviegoers. And to some extent, I totally don't like that point of view, and I totally disagree against it. I'd love to see more superhero movies with female leads that don't suck. You know, Scarlett Johansson has already proven herself that she's a great Black Widow, and she should really not only get her own movie, but at least let the girl show up more as in a supporting role in other Marvel movies, because it's a great, good character. And I'm not just saying that because it's Scarlett Johansson, although it helps. So, I am so sorry. I'm new to this. Okay, so, but sadly, it's almost like how anime in Japan has a lot of really good side characters, but we always spend time with its version of a bland character, or even when the bland character, or the supposed lead character, let's not call him a bland, is actually pretty good in his or her own right. Mostly him. It's modern day Japan is just as bad as modern day Hollywood. Like, say, Ichigo from Bleach. Bleach is a horrible anime series for many reasons, but Ichigo himself is a compelling lead character. Unfortunately, you barely see Ichiko because we don't spend time with the interesting side characters. We spend time with the not the jerk characters, basically. So it really does kind of suck today that it's all, and I'm guessing it's all marketing reasons. Like the studios themselves are afraid that if you have a interesting, non-bland, non-white character, non-relatable, everyday, a father man with a nuclear family, but he's still in his 20s, and he's still handsome, and he's, white bread, that they're afraid that it's going to alienate a lot of audience members. And although I'd like to personally think that audiences are smart enough to handle a female lead or a lead of color or even a Japanese character as the lead character, whether it's Ken Watanabe or Bryan Cranston, the cynic in me, or the nihilistic, I don't like human beings that much, I like individuals but I don't like them as a species, in me tells me that they probably would be alienated. In fact, it would be a sad fact to realize that the only reason the Transformer movies from Michael Bay do so well is because everyone can relate with Shia LaBeouf, or or whatever his idiotic character was named. Thank goodness we kind of got an upgrade with Mark Wahlberg in the 4th movie. I still don't have confidence, but at least it's Mark Wahlberg. So, no, I didn't say that. I had to. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm new to this. I had to do a happening reference. So, I'm trying to gather my thoughts here. I'm not good at improv either, by the way. So it does now. I think maybe if they gave Aaron Taylor Johnson's character a little more interesting depth or some sort of quirks, even if it's just very minor character moments, because as I've told many people in the past, small character moments go a long way at making a character three-dimensional, even if it's a very simple character moment. In Dr. No, there's this really great, it's not only a good James Bond movie, and unlike it is a very good James Bond movie, and unlike Godzilla 1954, which is a good movie in its own right, but often gets a pass because of a grandfather clause, I'd say Dr. No is a really good movie on its own right, even if you recommend it to somebody who's never seen a James Bond movie, and they decide not to revisit the other James Bond movies, but that's okay because Dr. No is a really good movie. One of the reasons for it is it's a slightly more subdued James Bond. And so much so that James Bond in that movie has a really great character moment where him and Ursula Andress, the girl in the white bikini, they're trapped by the villain Dr. No in his very impressive island laboratory. And this is their first meeting, they're actually invited to have dinner with Dr. No. It's a friendly interrogation, if you will. And there's a good scene where they're both holding hands and they're going to the meeting room. And Ursula Andress's character says, I'm kind of afraid to meet this Dr. No. And James Bond, played by, oh crap, oh Lord, how can I forget the name of the first actor who played James Bond? You know who I'm talking about. If I'm drawing a blank right now, it's forgivable. Sean Connery. Sean Connery playing James Bond. His reply to Ursula Andress is, well, I'd be lying if I say I wasn't afraid too. And it's like, I think Ursula Andress replies, I can tell your hands are as sweaty as mine. Now, the fact that James Bond, despite being an incredibly competent, super competent spy, has moments of small fear and hesitation like that, says wonders to the character than if you were to give the character a tragic backstory. And I know that has been done in later James Bond movies, usually with good effect, but also ill results. But it's little character moments like that that go a long way at making your character interesting. And that's something that the Marvel films do extremely well, even when you don't have the king of intelligence snark, Joss Whedon, doing the script. And even some of the Japanese monster movies from the past, especially the 60s, had small character moments that went a really long way. It also helped you had actually good actors. Like, one of the things that make Mothra, the original Mothra, such a good movie is because you have freaking Frankie Sakai, a really likable leading man / comedian who can actually pull off physical slapstick, like a scene where he actually beats up a bunch of gangster thugs all by himself. He's actually a very good lead character, and it's a shame because I think if Aaron Taylor Johnson was given a much more meatier script or allowed to do something more with his character, his lead character Brody might have been interesting enough to hold our interest when there was no monsters on screen. He's serviceable. He's not as bad as I think other critics have made him out to be, but it sucks that, again, it's banality at its worst as far as the Hollywood leading character goes. It's like, and I've already made a big point about that in the previous reviews. Now, sadly, the same thing can be said about a lot of the other side characters, especially Brody's immediate family, which sucks too because you also have some really good actors playing his. You have Elizabeth Olsen, the third Olsen twin you didn't know about, playing Ellie Brody. You know, and she can act. She can do. You know, I've seen her before. You also unfortunately have the blank staring little kid Moppet played by Carson Bloyd as Sam Brody, Ford and Ellie's son. I'm using Wikipedia, by the way. He's basically a blank staring Moppet that you see in a lot of movies that are almost just as bad as the leading banality. And it's sad too because there are a lot of really good seasoned veteran actors alongside Aaron Taylor Johnson. The most notable, of course, is Bryan Cranston as Joe Brody, Ford's father. Now, here's the funny thing. I like Bryan Cranston a lot. He's a great actor. He's a fun personality. I wish he got bigger roles. But I've never seen a freaking episode of Breaking Bad in my life. Put your pitchforks down and your torches. I've never seen an episode of Breaking Bad in my life. I don't really have much of an interest in revisiting the series now, even if it's canceled. And plus, I kind of gave up on primetime television ages ago. Largely because, you know, it's like anime. It takes forever to get from point A to point A and a half. And that's primetime television in general. The fact that Under the Dome was originally supposed to be a miniseries, and then they stretched it out to a second season, that doesn't sound good to me. But I'm familiar with Bryan Cranston from Malcolm in the Middle, all his anime voice acting. You know, in fact, they're going to be doing a big screen version of Power Rangers next year or the year after. How awesome would it be to get Bryan Cranston to come back and voice a big screen version of the Snizzard, one of the monsters he voiced from that show? That would be hilarious. It probably would never happen. Or maybe I'll be surprised. There's a lot of things that are surprising me, like LeVar Burton getting money left and right, and that the sixth Power Ranger in the current Super Sentai series, Tokyuger, is a reformed Monster of the Week. So there are surprises in the world that makes one happy. In fact, next year, Bryan Cranston should be playing the title role of the Dalton Trumbull biopic, simply called Trumbull. And not only is that a very interesting true life story and a very unfortunate figure that needs to be known more about in history, but Bryan Cranston playing Dalton Trumbull, I'm actually slightly more excited to see that movie than I am to see Bryan Cranston in Godzilla 2014. Spoilers ahead, he's not in the movie that much. In fact, his character gets... Spoilers. His character gets killed off pretty early in the movie. Not as badly as his wife, played by Juliette Binoche. Probably said that wrong. I'm sorry, everybody. Especially you, Juliette. Sandra Brody, Ford's mother. He actually gets killed off pretty early in the movie. Now, on one hand, you could say that's a pretty bold move, like what they did to that one actress in Psycho. Can't remember her name, not going to multitask here. But at the same time, Bryan Cranston, he's one of those few actors who's just very entertaining to see him, period. I think they would have done better if they kept him in the movie somehow. Maybe even had him team up with Ken Watanabe, and you could have these two side stories between the two scientists and Brody dealing with the military stuff. Again, a multi-layered movie, sort of like how Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster had a lot of little subplots and characters, even if all the characters were connected. Again, the cinema of coincidence. King Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster, is thy name. So, And then you have Ken Watanabe himself. Yeah, the man has a very thick accent. And yes, most Americans are really insensitive jerks when it comes to actors with accents, but he can still pull off English quite well, and he's a great actor. I know a lot of the popular opinion in Japan is that he's a traitor or a lapdog to the American Hollywood movie making system, which is a nasty thing to say. But then again, it's no different than when a well-loved American actor decides to do a bunch of commercials in foreign countries, and then he's later accused of being a traitor for doing work outside the country. Even, it's like, if the world loves you, flaunt it. Jean Reno from the 1998 Godzilla movie, and more so The Professional, he's so cool that we loved him even when he was in the 98 movie. So, 98 Godzilla movie. So, it is kind of sad that Bryan Cranston isn't in there too often, or his character gets killed off pretty early. I know some people like to make the joke that Bryan Cranston died because he wasted all his acting. He couldn't act no more, so he died. But let's face it, he got killed by a giant Muto. Okay, let's be realistic here, people. And then, of course, there's Ken Watanabe. He's awesome. But sadly, he's pretty much the scientific cipher in the movie. And it sucks, too, because traditionally scientists were usually the lead characters in a lot of these Japanese monster movies. Mostly because director Inoshiro Honda and a lot of his cast and crew, mostly his crew, they had a bias towards scientists in a positive sense, thinking that scientists would save the world. And considering how Congress keeps... and considering that recently Congress even told the Pentagon to stop worrying about climate change, I think they may have been onto something. In fact, the 1954 Godzilla has a really great scene with a bunch of politicians yelling at each other whether or not they should tell the public about Godzilla or not. More for political reasons than good reasons. So yeah, even back then, even Walt Disney threw in a bunch of Congress sucks jokes in a lot of his movies. But yeah, scientists were usually the lead characters, as well as reporters, amazingly. And sometimes they would shake up the formula by getting other characters, like Godzilla vs. Sea Monster and its a group of teenage castaways. And there are a lot of really good actors in this. Unfortunately, the screenplay isn't that strong when there are no giant monsters around. And a lot of the characters aren't really given much to do, even if the actors like Ken Watanabe and Bryan Cranston do a lot with what little is given them. So that does kind of suck. Like, the concept of a slow burn or a slow build-up to the giant monster action in the third act is not a bad idea. There's some movies out there that have done it very well. Them, from 1953, I think is a very good example of that. Or... I'm the only one that really likes this movie, so I'm probably the only one to say this. Gamera the Brave from 2005. It's mostly a family drama with some really good child actors and adult actors, but with giant monster overtones. And of course, when it reaches the 43-minute mark, when the giant monster action does start, it's continuous with its giant monster action, even if it goes back and forth with the human story. In fact, I think that Godzilla 2014 and Gamera the Brave are very similar to each other structurally, but Gamera the Brave manages to succeed a little better than Gamera 2014, despite that movie's sometimes cheesy flaws. And no, I'm not talking about the... I'll save that for the review of Gamera the Brave. So, and you know what's an even bigger problem is not only is this a problem with Hollywood movies today, but it's a problem with the giant monster genre in the last 10 to 15 years, where the giant monster elements are underplayed compared to boring, less enjoyable elements. Sometimes it works. Gamera the Brave has a compelling story even when there are no monsters on screen. Sometimes it doesn't work, even when it should. King Kong 2005 should have been called, and forgive my language, I really don't like cursing like everyone else, we're on a mother effing boat, the movie, because there's so much time spent on that goddamn boat that when you finally do get to Skull Island, it's not even worth it. It's like, what's the point of the destination when the trip takes so damn long? And it's funny too, because there's some movies where the opposite is true. The trip was a lot better than the destination. But I think I think if that movie spent less time on the boat, or at least gave us a little more interesting stuff to do on the boat, it'd be a much better movie. But then you look at the 33 movie, where, yeah, there's a long build-up to get to Skull Island, but when you're on Skull Island, you're on Skull Island. You know, it's like the trip and the destination are equally fun. And then, of course, there's Cloverfield, where the conceit was you don't see the monster. In fact, again, they only showed the monster at the last minute because they could afford some extra CGI, and Abrams and his cronies were a little more confident about it. Cronies isn't always a negative word. I can use that. Plus, it's very fun to say. But again, it's another movie where the giant monster is not an afterthought, but a secondary element to the human drama. Unlike most people, however, I don't mind it because the cast in Cloverfield, I actually like these likable, young, jet-set group of yuppie kids. They're likable yuppies. You don't see that in horror movies very much. Unfortunately, you also have Godzilla Final Wars, which very much suffered from the same thing that Michael Bay's Transformers suffered from. It's a movie where the director was not really interested in the kaiju elements, so instead he made this insane Matrix anime live-action ripoff in this kind of future world where the Earth Defense Force is kind of a totalitarian government, but on a good totalitarian government, or however you say it. Whatever the case, it's Matrix meets Equilibrium or something. And it's sad, too, because what few wacky giant monster fight scenes we do get in that movie are actually pretty good. Sadly, they're not counting a rather cool sequence where a bunch of superhumans take on Ebra the giant lobster single-handedly, which is actually a pretty good sequence. In fact, one of my friends, Adam, he compared it to if they made a live-action Contra movie with using good old creature effects, guys in creature suit effects. That's actually a very good fight scene. Unfortunately, every other fight scene in the movie is finished too quickly, or we keep cutting back to the human characters, which wouldn't be a bad idea. The idea of cutting back between a martial arts fight between two human characters, or an alien and a superhuman, and giant monsters, that's actually a pretty good idea. It's just not executed very well, and it's all the more unforgiving when this was the Godzilla's 50th anniversary movie, and instead of celebrating Godzilla as a birthday party, you got an obnoxious karate show with stock footage clips of Godzilla. There's lemonade in this, not soda. So, and no, that wasn't product placement. Nobody's going to see this video, so I don't think I need to censor anything. So, isn't that right, Toho? So, and the state of giant monster movies, you know, it's like, I don't want to say Pacific Rim kind of suffered from that, especially since they had some interesting, although very broad and offbeat characters in it. But then you have the current state of Japanese monster movies is insane because it's pretty much the Cloverfield effect all over again. You have these movies where they can't afford the monster effects because, believe it or not, a guy in a monster suit running around a model set is not as easy as you think it is. Relatively, it's a lot more easier and a lot less inexpensive than stop motion and CGI, but it's not a simple process. Or you see these giant monster movies in the hands of people who really don't give a crap about the giant monsters, but they still insist on throwing giant monsters for the sake of giant monsters. Monster X from Outer Space Strikes Back attacked the G8 Summit, which was I think it was a 2008, I might be mistaken on the year, sequel to the 1967 The X from Outer Space, which itself was more or less a straight-faced outer space adventure with a monster in it. Except, of course, you can't take it seriously because the monster of the movie, Gulala, the X himself, is so ridiculous looking, even by the standards of Japanese monster movies. That movie was pretty much just an overtly long, wore out its welcome satire of politicians from around the world. True, some of the actors who play the politicians, like the guy who plays the Roman Prime Minister, he's actually pretty funny, and he's actually one of the best parts of that movie, but it's a pretty crappy comedy. And it's a shame, too, because it actually comes from a Japanese director who's done really good comedies. Check out the Kali Mari Wrestler. That's a fantastic, low-budget, insane comedy movie that plays itself straight. And then you have other movies like Day of the Kaiju, which is actually a small-town political drama about the difficulties of disposing a kaiju dead carcass. That movie's coming out. It might actually be good if I finally see it, but it's another movie where don't even bother. It's like, why are you even bothering with the giant monster genre when you obviously don't care about it? Or you really don't want to focus on it. It's okay to have it as a secondary element, but still, it's getting ridiculous these days. Especially when a lot of the Japanese monster movies that are being made today are mostly comedies and spoofs that, like Death Kappa or Gihara the Long-Haired Monster. And that's a strange thing to say, because Gihara is actually a very good movie that stays faithful to the giant monster.